30 days ago, I stood in my kitchen looking at a bottle of olive oil, a bag of dried chickpeas, and a piece of salmon. And I asked myself a pretty simple question. Does any of this actually matter at my age? I'm over 60. I've read the headlines for years. Mediterranean diet this, Mediterranean diet that. And part of me always wondered if it was just something magazines print, because it sounds sophisticated and healthy, without much real evidence behind it. So I decided to actually test it myself, instead of just reading about it one more time. Not a strict diet in the sense of counting calories or banning entire food groups. More of an eating pattern shift. More olive oil instead of butter. More vegetables, legumes, and fish. A lot less processed and packaged food. For 30 days, I paid close attention to the things that actually matter day to day. Energy levels, digestion, how my joints felt on my morning walk, how I slept, and honestly, my mood, which I think we underrate as a health marker. And then, because I didn't want to just tell you I felt good and leave it at that, I went back through actual research, not wellness blogs, not influencer claims, but real sources. Harvard Health's coverage of long-term studies, a clinical trial published in the medical journal Gut, and a randomized controlled trial published in The Lancet. I wanted to know what's actually been measured in people our age, not just assumed or repeated because it sounds good. What I found genuinely surprised me. Some of it matched what I felt in my own body. Some of it didn't match at all, and I'll be upfront about that instead of pretending my 1 month proved something it didn't. And there's one finding, the last one on this list, that I think matters more than the other 4 combined, because it completely reframes what this whole eating pattern is actually about. Here's the plan for this video. I'm going to walk you through 5 things, counting down from 5 to 1, that real research supports about this way of eating for people over 60. For each one, I'll cover 3 things: what it actually is, in plain language, why it seems to work, meaning the mechanism behind it, not just the headline, and one small practical action you could try this week, the same way I did. Number 1 is the one I'd ask you to really sit with, because I think it changes how you look at the other 4. So stick around for that one. Before we go any further, though, I want to say something clearly, because this channel exists to help you, and I take that responsibility seriously. I'm not a doctor. I'm not a registered dietitian. Nothing in this video is a substitute for a conversation with the people who actually know your medical history, your medications, and your labs. If you're taking blood pressure medication, blood thinners, or diabetes medication, or if you're managing a chronic condition, please talk to your doctor before making changes to your diet. Some of what we're going to discuss, like foods high in vitamin K or shifting the type and amount of fat in your diet, can interact with certain medications, and only your doctor can weigh that properly for your specific situation. I'll repeat this again at the end. Okay, let's get into it. Number 5. Better physical function and lower frailty risk. Let's start with something that actually surprised me, because I went in expecting this diet to be all about the heart, and it is. We'll get there. But Harvard Health's own practical guide on the Mediterranean diet points out that in older adults specifically, this eating pattern has been associated with a decreased risk of frailty, along with better mental and physical function. Let's unpack what frailty actually means, because it's a word we hear thrown around loosely, but in medicine it's something specific and measurable. It typically refers to a cluster of changes: reduced grip strength, slower walking speed, unintentional weight loss, low physical activity, and general exhaustion. Doctors who specialize in aging watch these markers closely because frailty is strongly linked to a higher risk of falls, hospital stays, and losing independence in daily tasks, the things that actually determine quality of life. So why would what's on your plate affect any of that? The honest answer is that it's almost certainly a combination of factors working together, not one magic nutrient. Getting enough quality protein from fish, legumes, eggs, and dairy supports the maintenance of muscle mass, which naturally tends to decline with age if it isn't actively supported through diet and activity. Reducing the amount of highly processed, inflammatory food in your diet may help protect against the low-grade, chronic inflammation that researchers connect to muscle loss. And this eating pattern also tends to be naturally higher in nutrients like B vitamins, magnesium, and potassium, all of which play supporting roles in nerve signaling and muscle contraction, the basic machinery your body uses every time you get up out of a chair. Warm sunlight filtering through trees in a peaceful park, revitalizing atmosphere. During my own 30 days, I noticed my energy on my regular morning walk felt a little steadier. Not a dramatic transformation, nothing where I suddenly felt 20 years younger, but a subtle consistency I hadn't expected going in. I want to be completely transparent. That's one person's subjective impression over 1 month. It's not a controlled study, and I'm not presenting it as proof of anything. But it does line up in a small way with what the longer-term research describes. Practical action for this one: legumes. Number 4. A calmer gut and lower inflammation markers. This next one isn't based on an observational survey. It comes from an actual clinical trial, which is worth pointing out because that's a stronger form of evidence. A study published in Gut in February 2020 followed roughly 600 older adults, ages 65 to 79, splitting them into 2 groups, one following a Mediterranean-style diet and one continuing their regular diet. The group following the Mediterranean pattern showed changes in their gut microbiome that were linked to reduced inflammation. And here's the detail I found most interesting. When participants stopped following the diet, their gut microbiome tended to shift back toward its earlier, less favorable profile, which suggests this is an ongoing effort benefit, rather than something you bank permanently after a few weeks. Why does something happening in your gut matter for the rest of your body? Chronic, low-grade inflammation is one of the mechanisms researchers increasingly point to as a contributing factor across a range of age-related conditions, from joint stiffness to cardiovascular strain. Your gut microbiome, the trillions of bacteria living in your digestive tract, plays a real role in regulating how much inflammation your body produces on an ongoing basis. Fiber from vegetables, fruit, whole grains, and legumes essentially feeds the bacteria associated with producing anti-inflammatory compounds, while diets heavy in ultra-processed food tend to favor bacteria linked to the opposite effect. What I noticed personally, around day 10, my digestion felt noticeably more regular, and some mild bloating I'd honestly just gotten used to over the years eased up quite a bit. Again, I want to be careful here. That's one person, 1 month, with no lab work to confirm any of it. Practical action. Try building at least 1 meal a day around vegetables plus a whole grain as the base. Think a large salad with farro, brown rice, or barley, rather than treating vegetables as a small side dish that takes up a quarter of the plate almost as an afterthought. Number 3. Meaningful support for blood sugar regulation. This is a point where I want to be especially precise because it's an area where online content tends to exaggerate, and I don't want to add to that noise. The strongest evidence here comes from PREDIMMED Plus, a large, long-running clinical trial. According to Harvard Health's coverage, older adults who were at risk for diabetes and who followed a Mediterranean-style diet, combined with moderate physical activity, modest calorie reduction, and structured professional support, had a 31% lower risk of developing type 2 diabetes over 6 years, compared to those who followed the dietary pattern by itself, without those additional supports. Notice the wording there carefully, because it matters. That 31% figure is not the diet operating in isolation. That's diet plus activity plus support, working together as a package. That distinction tends to get lost when this kind of statistic gets repeated online, stripped down into a catchier but less accurate headline, and I think it's important to keep it intact. Why might this combination help regulate blood sugar? Fiber and healthy fats slow the rise in blood sugar after a meal compared to refined carbohydrates like white bread or sugary snacks. Cutting back on added sugar and heavily refined grains lowers the glycemic load, and physical activity helps your muscles use glucose more efficiently for fuel, which likely explains why the combined approach outperformed the diet on its own in this particular trial. The pieces genuinely seem to reinforce each other. As for my own experience, I genuinely can't tell you anything meaningful because I didn't have my blood sugar tested before or after this month, and I'd encourage you not to draw conclusions from how you feel on something like this either. Blood sugar is where subjective feelings are unreliable. Practical action. If you're at risk for type 2 diabetes or already managing it, talk to your doctor or a registered dietitian about whether adding structured physical activity alongside any dietary changes makes sense for your specific situation. And please, never adjust diabetes medication. Number 2. Real cardiovascular protection, even later in life. Here's one of the most rigorous pieces of evidence on this entire list. A randomized controlled trial, considered the strongest type of study design in medical research, was published in The Lancet. Researchers followed people who already had heart disease for 7 years. Those who followed a Mediterranean diet had a 26% lower risk of having a heart attack or stroke compared to people following a low-fat diet instead. Both groups met regularly with a dietitian. Throughout the trial, this wasn't people figuring it out alone with no professional guidance along the way. What's the mechanism behind this? The Mediterranean pattern is high in monounsaturated fat, primarily from olive oil, which is linked to healthier cholesterol patterns, generally lower LDL, the so-called bad cholesterol, alongside a better overall lipid balance. It's also naturally lower in the ultra-processed foods and refined carbohydrates that have been linked to elevated blood pressure and vascular inflammation over time. I want to underline something important about this study. The participants already had existing heart disease. This was what researchers call a secondary prevention setting, meaning it wasn't about preventing a first event, but reducing the risk of another one after a diagnosis had already occurred. Practical action. If you or someone you love has cardiovascular disease, this is a very reasonable topic to raise with your cardiologist or primary care doctor. Not as a replacement for medication, but as something that may work alongside it, always under their guidance. Number 1. A meaningfully higher chance of reaching 70 without chronic disease. This is the finding I promised you at the start, and honestly, it's the one that stuck with me the most since I first read it. Harvard Health highlights a study of more than 10,000 women, ages 57 to 61 at the outset, which found that those who followed a Mediterranean-style eating pattern were 46% more likely to live to age 70 or older without developing a major chronic disease, compared to those who didn't follow that pattern. Read that again, because the wording matters enormously. This isn't just lived longer. It's lived to 70 without a major chronic disease showing up somewhere along the way. That's a fundamentally different and honestly more meaningful kind of outcome to measure. It's not only about years, it's about how much of those years you spend actually feeling like yourself, able to do the things you want to do without a diagnosis quietly reshaping your daily life. Why might this happen? Harvard's own coverage points out that diet isn't operating alone here. Lifestyle habits, including regular physical activity, adequate rest, and genuine social connection, also contribute meaningfully to these outcomes. So this final point isn't really about one clever food swap. It's about a broader, interconnected pattern of living. Real food. Moving your body, sleeping enough, and staying connected. The diet itself is simply the most marketable and easiest to package part of that larger pattern. It was never really meant to work in isolation. And honestly, that reframes this entire video for me. My experiment. What a typical day of eating actually looked like. Before we close out, I know some of you are wondering what this actually looked like on my plate day to day. So let me give you a quick, honest picture. Not a rigid meal plan, just what I found sustainable. Breakfast tended to be plain yogurt with walnuts and berries, or whole grain toast with a small amount of olive oil and sliced tomato. Lunch was usually some combination of leafy greens, a legume like lentils or chickpeas, and a generous drizzle of olive oil with lemon. Dinner leaned heavily on fish 2 or 3 times a week, with the other nights built around vegetables, whole grains, and smaller portions of poultry. Red meat showed up maybe once, at most twice, across the entire month, rather than being a daily default. None of this required special ingredients or expensive substitutes. It was mostly about shifting proportions. I also want to mention, I didn't do this perfectly. There were dinners out where I ate whatever was served. Perfection isn't the point here. Consistency mattered more. A few honest challenges I ran into. I also want to be upfront about what didn't feel effortless. Cooking with fresh vegetables and legumes regularly does take more prep time than opening a box or a can of something processed. That's just true. Prep time is a real barrier. Fish, especially fresh fish, can also be more expensive. So I leaned on canned sardines and frozen fish fillets some weeks to keep costs reasonable. And honestly, they worked just fine. Eating out was the trickiest part to navigate. Restaurant menus aren't built for this. So on the few occasions I ate out this month, I did my best, choosing grilled over fried, asking for olive oil instead of butter when possible, but I didn't stress over it. This isn't meant to be an all-or-nothing approach, and I don't think it should be marketed that way. So, 30 days in, what actually changed for me? Digestion improved a little. Energy on my walks felt slightly more consistent. Nothing dramatic, nothing I'd call life-changing after a single month. And I want to be honest about that, instead of overselling it to you. What the actual research suggests is that the real payoff from this way of eating tends to show up over years, not weeks, through measurable cardiovascular risk reduction, better support for physical function as we age, and meaningfully more years lived without major chronic disease. I'm going to keep going past this initial 30 days because everything I've found while researching this points toward this being a long game pattern rather than a quick fix you do for a month and then abandon once the novelty wears off. One more reminder. Before you go, one more reminder. This content is for educational purposes only and is not medical advice. Please consult your doctor before making changes to your diet or routine, especially if you take medication or have a health condition. Your doctor is the only person equipped to weigh that properly. If you've tried eating this way yourself, or you're thinking about giving it a shot, I'd genuinely like to know. What's the one food swap that felt easiest for you to actually stick with long term? Tell me in the comments below. I read every single one, and honestly, it helps me figure out what to dig into. Thank you for spending this time with me today. I'll see you in the next one.